Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. This week, we bring you a special interview with Dr. Anthony Monteiro of the Philadelphia Free School. He is one of the leading scholars of W.E.B. Du Bois and uses that lens to analyze our contemporary domestic and foreign policies in a way that is sure to leave listeners long-winded in their responses. Whether you see his thought as deliciously dialectical or contrarian to the point of consternation, you don't want to miss this. So, Tony, some years ago you argued in an article that the concept of double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois put forward originally in The Souls of Black Folk and then later in other writings was kind of this dialectic of America, and it provided an insight into potentially the future of where civilization was going to move away from the age of Europe to the age of humanity. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a good place to begin. Of course, Du Bois first put this idea of double consciousness forward in The Souls of Black Folk, as you mentioned, and it was a transgressive, subversive concept and was paradigm setting for a number of reasons. First of all, after slavery and after Reconstruction, a whole number of theories were put forward about the humanity of Black folk. In other words, some would say that we were of low intelligence, that we were not ready for the vote, and not because we were at such a low level of civilization, that and that we literally did not have agency or intentionality. And another way to talk about that would be consciousness. And Du Bois took these ideas of intentionality, of striving, of knowing, and of consciousness. And forgive me if I'm going a little broadly on this, but almost in Hegel-like ways, Du Bois talked about a people's spiritual striving as represented in a movement of consciousness through history. But he adds a twist upon it because he says that African Americans do not have, as Hegel suggested about world history, which in Hegel's idea did not include Africans, but for Hegel it was a straightforward and upward movement towards an ultimate goal. Du Bois argues that Black people proceed through history in a double consciousness, knowing themselves both as they are, but also as the world, or in this case, the white world, sees them. So it is a clash, almost a clash of civilization, a clash of consciousnesses, the two, of the African and of the European, of the Black and of the white. I have argued that there is a subtle and profound dialectic here, a historical dialectic, which is resolved in a new level, as Hegel would say, a new synthesis. And that new synthesis, I suggested, would be manifested in a worldwide movement from the age of Europe, of that consciousness that Hegel talked about and which Hegel relied upon to take humanity to its ultimate level of knowing and being. But it was European. For Du Bois, the contradiction of the two manifested in the double consciousness of African Americans, but on a worldwide level of Europe versus the majority of humanity, I said that it would be resolved in a new synthesis as we would move from the age of Europe, the age when Europe is the hegemon, the colonialist, the slave owner, the capitalist, the imperialist, from the age of Europe to the age of humanity.
I think that provides a lot of important insights into understanding foreign policy with this White House, diplomatic affairs of America in the wider world, and the geopolitical scene in general in a way that moves thought outside of a very limited and very, the term would be Eurocentric, but Amerocentric, U.S.-centered vision that really just doesn't account for the fact that American imperialism has really taken a beating in the past 20 years.
Yes, yes. Well, Hegel is very important for Du Bois, as I've discussed, in this unique Du Boisian existentializing of Hegel. I think it's one of the most significant reorderings of Hegel. Others attempted it. For example, I would say maybe Heidegger and maybe Sartre. But also, there was another Hegelian movement in the United States at the time that Du Bois is writing about double consciousness, and that is the Hegelianism of, let us say, Walt Whitman, who saw in the American spirit the ultimate manifestation of modern man's striving for this new level of being and knowing in the world. It would also come back with John Dewey, the pragmatist and theorist of democracy and education, who, like Whitman, saw the American culture, the American people, by which both meant primarily white people, as the bearers of a new humanity, a new possibility, a new almost infinitude in the sense of a realization of an absolute ideal. But Du Bois's dialectic is a dialectic of liberation, not a dialectic of a realization of a telos, a la Whitman and John Dewey. That is very important as we speak. What you called an American centrism, others have called a Pax Americana, as in a Pax Romana. The peace established, the world peace established by the U.S. empire. This is now in retreat. It is being dismantled. It is causing great consternation and anxiety among American elites about the possibility of a world that dialectically is moving from an age of Europe, and then, of course, Europe being defended by America after World War II, moving from that age to an age of humanity. Now, this new age is finding its greatest, most important push forward in Asia. But Asia is not that distant civilizationally or historically from Africa. And hence, we are on, I think, the verge of a new age, an age of humanity, a new possibility, a new democracy, a new form of organizing social life. Now, this will not be a metaphysical process, and therefore it will have all of the backs and forths and ups and downs that define what it means to be human and human history unfolding in actual terms rather than ideal or metaphysical terms.
We've got people, a whole contingent of people that have gone really extreme in this very panic and very alarmist view about the Trump administration. And I think, first of all, they don't conceptually grasp what you're alluding to, but also, putting it bluntly, I do not recall the collapse of any empire ever being a Tea Party at all. I mean,
right.
Whether you look at the divestment from the Indian subcontinent, from historic Palestine, or the Russian Empire collapsing in the wake of World War I and leading to the Russian Revolution, it's always been a mess.
Yeah. Yes. There's no question about it. And if you can't deal with messiness, you should get out of the game of revolution. There are all kind of risks involved. There are no guarantees except that one can see the overall movement of history, but how history will unfold is never guaranteed. I think a lot of people who consider themselves to be left and consider themselves to be, in fact, smarter than everybody else, are now caught in a mess of their own creation because they have no way of understanding the dismantling of the Pax Americana that is represented by the Trump presidency, but is in many ways being demanded by masses of American people. Because, see, you can't uphold the Pax Americana without endless war. And so if the American people, and I'm reading into the collective political behaviors that I see, if the American people are weary of war and don't want war, in effect, the only alternative to war is peace with the rest of the world. And hence, ultimately, masses of American people will and must come to the conclusion that a just or positive peace means peace with justice. And that means justice at home as well as in the world. So, you know, one can, you know, I think, let me put it this way. You know, a lot of these thinkers they have their backs up against the wall. They can't get out. They painted themselves into an ideological political corner where they can explain very little and have no idea of what to say to the broad masses of people in terms of a program for change. They do not understand the struggle for peace. They do not understand, as you have pointed out, the messiness of the process of dismantling of an empire. I mean, you mentioned the Russian Revolution. It doesn't get any messier and unpredictable than that was. But fortunately, they had leadership, which was bold, which had a theory, which came forward with a program, which ultimately won millions of Russian peasants and workers and middle-class people and intellectuals to a vision of possibility. And that's why it was ultimately successful. But on our side, we have a lot of people who are on the fringes of history and on the fringes of political and social life, who can only shout at people who are trying to mix it up with the masses and be a part of what can be a great transformation of our country in the context of a great transformation that is already taking place on a global scale.
Right. So I think that opens up the opportunity to discuss what's going on in Europe and how to gauge the implosion right before our eyes in real time of the EU and the Eurozone project, and where Russia fits into that conversation, particularly because it's interesting to see how people have a whole wide range of opinions about how radicals should be acting towards Russian media and Russian discourse and outlets like RT and Sputnik and Kremlin-funded media outlets that, while I certainly see they've got a very, realpolitik guided agenda. They function on the behalf of the Russian state in order to promote their efforts, and that's part of just common sense soft power. I think it's interesting also to look at the fact that China and Russia are moving closer together. You've seen Russia standing up recently for the sovereignty of Venezuela, so there's a lot of contradictions.
Oh yeah, as there must be. But you're right. I mean, in a lot of ways to understand current U.S. politics towards Russia, you have to go back to 2014 and the bloody and illegal, I guess illegal is expresses what a coup d'etat is anyway. It was an overturning of a democratic election through a military coup d'etat, which was supported, organized in a lot of ways, and financed by the United States, and particularly the State Department under Hillary Clinton. And that overthrow was a part of a real old thing going back to the Russian Revolution of using Ukraine as a base to overturn the Russian Revolution, separating Ukraine from the Soviet Union, which ironically was done by Yeltsin and his crew of counter-revolutionaries. But nonetheless, 2014 and the Maidan coup d'etat was about creating a base for a what they call, quote, a color revolution or a counter-revolution to overthrow Putin in Russia. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying, I'm agreeing, yeah, right.
Yeah, and so they were successful at least up until the 2019 election in creating this kind of hostile political force in Ukraine that was targeting Russia. Of course, Putin's, quote, crime was that he defended the national interest of Russia against a counter-revolution which was fomented in the United States and many European capitals. That was his crime. So the crime of Trump, the ultimate crime of Trump, is that he, rather than pursuing the neocon war policies that were advanced by Clinton and the corporate and war Democrats, said that he wanted détente with Russia. That was his crime. And to say that meant that he had to be an agent of Russia. Anyone who would make such a, quote, outlandish proposal that we have peaceful coexistence with another highly nuclear-armed power must be insane, quote, unquote, because peace is off of the agenda and an insane proposal. And this is the same with Tulsi Gabbard. She has to be an agent of Russia and Assad and anybody else the United States doesn't like if she proposes peace. So to understand European, but especially American politics, you have to see 2014 and the push for a counter-revolution to overthrow Putin and the democratic government, in democratically elected government in Russia. Now, the Dems, the Democratic Party, and this pretty much means all of them, including the so-called progressives and the so-called corporatist pro-Pentagon forces, either aggressively agree with the anti-Russia push or are silent in the face of it, which is agreement with it. So the Democratic Party, and this is the irony of history, the irony of the dialectics of American politics, the Democratic Party is more of an elite, pro-war, monopoly capitalist, pro-imperialist party than the Republican Party is, or we might call it today the Trump Party, which is more about imperial retreat and living in a multipolar world rather than in a unipolar, single hegemon world. And of course, just to end on, I mean, you know, Tulsi Gabbard is the most recent target of the Pentagon and the intelligence services and their mass media stooges in this struggle. But, you know, she's a very strong and courageous woman, and I think she's going to come out of this as perhaps, if not the leading candidate in the Democratic primary, at least a major contender. She's going to leap over Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Buttigieg and the rest of them. Mm-hmm. And she's going to ultimately be in that top-tier configuration, I think. And let me just say one other thing, Andrew, quickly. She is now positioning herself to attract all of those Bernie people from 2016 who have never gotten over his capitulation to Hillary and the corporate war Democrats in the 2016 election, and are looking for a viable protest candidate who stands for values that they can identify with. And I think Tulsi is going to be what Bernie was in 2016. And I would not rule out her coming out of the Iowa caucuses among the top three candidates.
That's a really interesting take. One thing that jumps to mind that I think makes for an interesting speculation is this animus coming from the Clinton camp purely because of the sort of motivations that drove antagonizing, say, Jill Stein in the Green Party, or is part of it because Tulsi has a connection to the BJP and Narendra Modi, who in turn is a pretty close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, and there's no love lost between Clinton Democrats and the Likud party.
No, this is a very interesting, that's why in a lot of ways you got to look at a process rather than static kind of realities. This is a process. She is saying that these wars, these endless neocon wars, which is bipartisan, both Democratic and Republican wars, are useless and have done tremendous damage to the American people, not just to the nation, but to the people. This is a position which recognizes the inevitability and the necessity of what I call an imperial retreat. And she, while, she has these, what they call connections to Modi, I don't know how deep they are. They could also say that she has connections to Assad in Syria. But and all of this for me is still being researched. How deep are these relationships? Is she, as some would argue, a reactionary who for the moment is putting on progressive clothing? No, I think she comes organically from the people, and her anti-war position, first of all, represents the position of the people that she represents in the House of Representatives. So to be pro-peace is to be pro the people who elected her to Congress. The other thing is probably the majority of Democrats, or at least those who will vote in these primaries, are in one or another way pro-peace. And they were holding their breaths, waiting for pro-peace candidates to come along. Now, saying this, we have to say, Tulsi Gabbard is not an anti-imperialist. She is anti-war in the sense of these endless neocon wars. Effectively, she is in favor of an imperial retreat from war. Now, we who are anti-imperialists, who see a larger process of a transition from an age of Europe and European hegemony to an age of humanity, see this as part, maybe a small, maybe a larger part of a bigger process to which we who are activists, we who are revolutionaries, we who are anti-imperialists must weigh in and say that it does not begin or end with Tulsi or Trump or anyone else that sees the inevitability of retreat, but it begins with the long history of anti-war, peace, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-white supremacy activism, kind of crystallized in the 1950s in W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called communists." Is that praise for the communists or condemnation for the peacemakers? I mean, it is Robeson who said, "Here I stand for peace and anti-colonialism and the freedom of black folks." That's where we go back to. That's the wellspring of what we're talking about. So Tulsi is a kind of manifestation of a mass unhappiness and disquiet with the warfare state, with all of the resources of the country going towards war. But she does not define us. Our job is to define the larger historical process into which she is now a part. And that's the way I see it. So I don't hold her to the same standard of an anti-imperialist like myself. I don't see her as a revolutionary. I see her as a practical politician who, representing her constituents, and in fact, a whole lot of veterans who she served with in Afghanistan and Iraq, she is representing them, and I think the majority, I'll put it this way, the majority of the Democratic Party base.
You're touching on something that's really interesting to me, and it's something that goes right over the head of a lot of these intellectuals we were alluding to earlier, and it's this completely ahistorical and really just illiterate notion that there's this insurgent, fascist, anti-war strain in American politics that's popping up out of the depths, and it's almost like a Stephen King horror film.
Right.
But I'm cognizant of the reality of the America First movement during the 1930s. And it was a bipartisan, liberal, and conservative strain that had everyone from Norman Thomas and Bob La Follette to Charles Lindbergh and Gore Vidal and the Kennedys involved in it. And I wonder, I think it kind of finds its most clear materialization these days around the whole Libertarian Party, antiwar.com contingency that congregated around somebody like Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012. And what's your thought on how to gauge that entire strain of Republican anti-interventionism?
Well, can I just, you went back to the 1930s. I think that's important. But, I guess you would have to call me a dialectician. I see things in process. I see consciousness as a struggle between opposing positions, all sometimes not antagonistic, but nonetheless opposing ideas. And in the 21st century, the America First or the pro-America nativist movement is in many ways a response by a lot of people, especially white working and lower middle class people, who see the left, and I put quotes and define it in very amorphous ways, not so defined. The left has separated itself from the masses of people and have become, quote, anti-American, and have pointed to all of the flaws and weaknesses of the consciousness of the broad mass of white people. In a lot of ways, I should say, without any empirical evidence, that they're all racist, that they're all homophobes, that they're all misogynists, that white America is essentially reactionary. At some point, these people would respond in whatever way they could to this elitist idea that they, as human beings, as workers, as whoever, were no good and that they were a scourge upon humanity. So Make America Great is a dialectical response to a elitist coastal intelligentsia, university-based for the most part, often also situated in non-governmental organizations that are promoted by corporate philanthropies. In the heartland, in the middle of the country, these people had a sense that we're being put down, we're being shitted upon by these elitists, and we're going to strike back and say, in effect, F you, we're worth something, and this is what we're going to do in the face of your condemnation of us. Now, but that's not the end of the story, because at the same time, these people also are tired of war. They're tired of living in communities where there's no infrastructure, where bridges are falling apart, where there is no education. So there is, at this time, a deep disquiet, a deep anger, a deep resentment towards the intellectual, bureaucratic, pretty much coastal elites, urban-based, by the way, in gentrified neighborhoods, who think they have a right to pass final moral judgment upon tens of millions of people and have a right to tell these people how they should live, what they should believe in, and so on. And a lot of the discourse and practice coming from these people is more symbolic than actual. I think most of them are as willing to come up with some serious way to manage guns and opioids and other social problems that affect them like everybody else. But the gun and their right to a gun is symbolic or a metaphor of their rights as poor or working class people. You're not going to take my guns is a way of saying you're not going to erase me from the political landscape. So I say all of that to say that, yes, I agree with those leftists or reputed or nominal leftists who claim that, well, you know, there is a threat of fascism. There's been a threat of fascism for several decades through Republican and Democratic administrations in the White House. The fascists are not reliant upon elections. So the German model doesn't really work in this situation. The fascists are deeply embedded in the state, in the permanent government. Now we have a rebellion against them, quite profound. Just to end, you know, Andrew, I feel that these doctrinaire, dogmatic, intellectual leftists don't get it. They're not a part of history, and they're not a part of the people. And they're now experiencing what I see as a intellectual, moral, and personal meltdown. And so most of them, you say around online journals, most of them will not, for very long, even be a voice or presence on the political landscape.
So one aspect that we kind of skirted around, but I think it's useful to think about, is the role of America's relationship with Russia, because that remains a major aspect of our conversations today, even whether it's Syria, the Ukraine and Crimea, the issues pertaining to sanctions and the moves being made to curtail things like attacks on Iran and Venezuela. So I'm wondering if you ever had the opportunity to look at that unpublished manuscript Du Bois wrote about Russia and America and their future together working in harmony, as opposed to this, what became the Cold War.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me just say one thing. You know, you mentioned a number of, quote, crimes of Putin and Russia. You can add to that Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Russia's support for Maduro in Venezuela. So, you know, Russia and Putin have transgressed American, I put quote, interest on a number of fronts. Yeah, I mean, it's like what King said. Du Bois was literally saying, or King was literally saying what Du Bois said. Either in international relations there will be nonviolence or non-existence. And that's the fact of the matter. Peaceful coexistence between the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States, or the potential of no existence. The Hillary Clintons, and she's come out of the slime and the sewer to attack Tulsi and others who would dare speak about the possibility of studying war no more. Hillary Clinton and those were pushing the envelope. They were brinksmen, and this kind of brinksmanship in international relationships. And the final prize in the neocon game was to overturn Putin and install a pro-U.S. subservient regime in Russia. That has failed. It is driving them insane. And Clinton not only looks like a crazy woman, she talks like a crazy woman. And that's where we are. And the people, and this is what is so interesting, because, you know, Du Bois and King, they believe deeply in people as ultimately a democratic force. You know, King always talked about the moral arc of the universe. tending towards justice and peace. But it's because people, if they understand what is in their interests, will study war no more. So here we are again. The people have produced out of obscurity from a congressional district in an island which was occupied in an imperial project by the United States and then incorporated into the U.S. nation without the consent of the people, the original people. From that island comes this woman who is saying that the people don't want to study war no more. And I'm prepared to stand up to the most powerful politicians and to the war makers and proclaim that I speak for the people and you don't. This is the poetry of this moment. This is, it's almost literary in its sublimeness. So one can therefore feel a sense of optimism that the American people are not what this academic and cultural left have said they are. They are capable of great things. And of course, it takes great crises to bring forward the best in a people. That's the way I see it right now, Andrew.
So how do you feel about what we can call communism, socialism in the global South, and how do you think solidarity looks with that? Because there's a certain irony to the fact that China was the one that lasted longer than the Soviet Union, and after having banged the drum for so many years about revisionism with Mao and the whole Maoist movement, they're essentially the powerhouse in Asia that's quickly in the passing lane and is going to supersede American dominance in regional economic power, because they've embraced the very what was called the right opposition, Nikolai Bukharin's program of building the productive power of their economy, as opposed to what was the model that was popularized first by Stalin and later by Mao Zedong.
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. You know, I think to understand Chinese international and domestic politics at this moment, you have to go back to 2012 and the Party Congress, which brought Xi Jinping forward as the leader of the party and of the state, the Chinese state. That is the turning point. And in the unique Chinese political culture, they have defined this era as the era of the thought of Xi Jinping, which means, in effect, that Xi Jinping and his colleagues have assessed the moment as one where China can now move confidently and quickly to its form of socialist reorganization of the economy and society. And thus, what was called in classic Leninist terms the dictatorship of the proletariat will be manifested in these unique ways of a technologically advanced, economically powerful, and socially, culturally united population, which is not just an opposition to the West and in particular the United States, but will surpass them. Xi Jinping has this slogan, catch up and surpass. I think they have caught up. Now they're in the mode of surpassing the West technologically and economically. They have a superior mode of organization of the economy and the state, which makes it possible for them to achieve things that are unimaginable in the West, such as lifting 300 million people out of poverty, the great technological achievements, not only of the G5, the new technology of information, but in new forms of public transportation and super fast electric trains and who knows what else. And of course, the strategic alliance with Russia is resolving a problem that goes back many decades. These two potential powerful nations united in a common objective of remaking world social, political, economic relations. This is all very, very positive, and it is a part of the movement from the age of Europe to the age of humanity. What was the other part of your question, Andrew?
How do you think it's very common to see a lot of particularly white radical thinkers, whether they're anarchists, Trotskyists, or even hardcore Maoists who really, and they make a common cause with liberals about how Deng Xiaoping basically sold out the Communist Party and they're communists in name only. And it's a tired old narrative. Everybody knows it. It comes and goes. And I think there's more nuance to it that it merits further consideration.
Oh, yeah. I would agree with you. I mean, I have never been pro-Deng Xiaoping, but as I've become older and, quote, wiser, or hopefully wiser, the Chinese Revolution emerged out of extreme chaos in a society that had broken down, was literally on life support. I think the crisis in China at the time that the communists took power there in 1949 was worse than the crisis in Russia when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917. China was a mess. They had lost, according to some commentators, up to 30 million people in the Japanese occupation and the civil wars between 1931 and 1949. And then the Communist Party, they had a lot of heroic people, but how do you run a state? I mean, we could overthrow the state, we could mobilize the people in revolutionary struggle, but how do you rebuild society? And I think the period between 1949 and 1979 was a period of some advances in the society, but also a period of deep crisis, of not knowing how we're going to go forward, of splits within the Communist Party, within the society in general, many of which had become antagonistic. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was neither great proletarian nor cultural revolution, was a part of a political struggle. And it ends with the death of Mao. And then I would say Deng Xiaoping represented, who himself was a part of the revolutionary struggle. Deng Xiaoping represented an attempt to stabilize Chinese society. Now, of course, he comes to power in a state and in a party which literally was at political war, not only with the Soviet Union, but with many of the revolutionary forces around the world, including those in Africa, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. So it's locked now in a situation and ideologically where they have cut themselves off from the revolutionary movements. Even India And so they turned to the United States, and the United States is willing to, quote, help them, but China must provide cheap labor for the West. And China must be in foreign policy subservient to the Western, even neocon projects. However, and how this was done, I don't know that anybody has really detailed it. China was able, as they say, to take lemons and make lemonade. It transformed what was to be a subservient relationship into a situation where China is now talking about surpassing the West. And so from the Xi Jinping era, 1979, pretty much to 2012, that, what is that, about 35, 40 years, I guess, 10, 20, about 30 years, a little more than 30 years, out of what was one step backward, we get Xi Jinping, who represents two steps forward. It is an interesting process. And so out of what appeared to be a major retreat and a major undoing of the ambitions and stated goals of the Communist Party and the Chinese Revolution, out of that one step backward, we now have a situation where China is now, will be in the future, if not now, the major economic, political, and perhaps military power in the world.
What do you think are some significant things, either domestically with regards to electoral politics or in regards to political movements besides Tulsi Gabbard that merit a lot of attention?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that merit attention happening among ordinary people. I'm here in Philadelphia, and we're always active among the people in the churches and the unions and the civic organizations, in the political organizations. And it's almost, you're seeing something like, with the people saying we're fed up with the way things are. And, I'm working mainly with the African American community. We're fed up with the way things are. We're not going to vote for any Democrat who just wants our votes and not going to deliver anything for us. We're tired of the collapse of infrastructure, the collapse of schools, the gentrification. I think people like Gabbard are just a manifestation of something far more profound than she. So what I'm seeing among the masses is that we're on the cusp of what could be a great social upheaval, more radical and more consequential than even the 60s. All movements, of course, need leadership. We're lacking in that, but perhaps there will be, as they say, where there's a will, there's a way. And the people are angry, and not just passively so, but actively angry and looking for ways to transform the situation that we're faced with. And I could point to certain developments here in Philadelphia, beginning with the election of Krasner, our current DA, who, has done some very exceptional things. For instance, in the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, where Judge Tucker said there was every reason that Mumia should have a new trial. By the way, Tucker was the first time that Mumia's case was heard before a black judge. And Krasner, while going through certain bureaucratic processes that I guess he had to go through, came out and said, they would not challenge Mumia's right to a new trial, and in fact handed over 6 boxes of previously hidden documents that are pro-Mumia. This is a very important thing. And the second thing is there was a situation where a young bicycle food delivery guy got into a confrontation with a white developer, and it turned into a fight, and the white developer ended up being killed. And the DA's office refused to charge the young black man with murder. And in the trial, a jury, which was fairly constituted, found the young black man not guilty. Now, Krasner was elected by the black community. I mean, completely by the black community for the most part. And so there are things like this going on. And then you layer on that this strike wave that is beginning to sweep the country. The General Motors workers, the teachers in Chicago, the teachers in West Virginia and other places, and a new boldness in the working class. And then, of course, you layer on top of that this peace sentiment, this anti-war sentiment among the people. And I can tell you here in Philadelphia, you know, we're doing a whole year celebrating Gandhi, the anti-colonial struggle in India, and Martin Luther King. And the city council unanimously passed a resolution, and a resolution that is anti-colonial and anti-racist. And so you see this going. I'm certain that similar things are happening around the country. The anti-police sentiment, especially in the black community. So I am hopeful. I think we are on the cusp of a profound transition to a new level of resistance and struggle. I think the masses outside, if the Democrats keep attacking Tulsi, masses of people will abandon the Democratic Party to form a new peace and justice party, or not participate in politics at all and take to the streets and organize and so on. So that's what I'm seeing.
So I want to take advantage of your long range of history and consider for a second DSA, which gets all the good copy and all the headlines in all the progressive Democratic publications. And they've got, like I've mentioned to you before, they've got a killer graphic designer working at Jacobin magazine. So you were around when DSA first materialized out of the old Norman Thomas Socialist Party.
I think I was. Although, you know, I have to say I didn't take great notice of it at the time. I didn't think it was significant. And it pretty much wasn't back in those days.
That's what I gather from everyone else. It was until probably the late 60s, early 70s, essentially a lot of old-time what were called cathedral socialist, armchair revolutionary types who had become white-collar workers, and their most significant political impact in politics in the late 60s actually was being on the absolute wrong side of history during the New York teachers' strike. So I'm wondering... Well, okay, you go.
I thought that what the DSA was first of all, a lot of nominal socialists who were also anti-communist. And it is only with the collapse of the Soviet Union and much of the world revolutionary movement, or it being thrown into crisis, that democratic socialism gets some political capital and and certainly with the election of Trump, a good part of the ruling class and the academic intelligentsia joined the DSA. And of course, then they have this Bois piece, Jacobin. It's a very slick intellectual magazine, something like Dissent or Partisan Review were back in the days. So they rise because I think, I have to say, that they are the type of moderate socialists who could say to the people that, look, socialism is not a bad idea, just as long as it's separated from communism or actual socialism. The other side of it is that it has within it many of the neocons, and they're very anti-Xi Jinping in China, anti-Putin, pretty much anti the non-white world. And what the DSA is arguing is that they can save capitalism better than the capitalists can. I think you were going to see it unravel. I mean, their idea that they're going to take over the Democratic Party, and then what does that mean? What is the Democratic Party? I think is not an inspiring project for masses of people. So it will be like you said, like they originally were, armchair socialists and intellectual socialists who find the masses to be unworthy of them. And that's it. I mean, I don't know where they go. I don't think Bernie Sanders has much of a future as in terms of winning the Democratic primary to be president. I think Tulsi is the rising figure, and it's because she's tapped into something that the people are about, and that is, let's end these wars, let's stop spending $7-8 trillion to kill people when we need it here at home.
So I want to close with one question that goes to the metaphysical, spiritual level that we started out on, but returns to your favorite James Baldwin.
Oh, boy.
And it boils down to this. I've read his later stuff where he goes through that gateway of saying to hell with white liberalism because it's just going nowhere. And the fire next time is coming because they aren't serious about the actual ending of white supremacy. And basically, I want to rhetorically present you, what the hell does Bernie Sanders know about the Democratic Party that James Baldwin didn't?
Well, see, here you have the difference between an apologist, albeit in left clothing for capitalism and imperialism, and on the other side with Jimmy Baldwin, a profound and principled critic of it. And so socialism that apologizes for imperialism and a critic who attacks it. So I would take Baldwin on any day before a Bernie Sanders, even though there are policy proposals for health care and other things and the minimum wage that I agree with Bernie on. But this is not a question, and this is not a moment where policy and policy wonks are a substitute for truth tellers. So I choose the truth teller. If I could just return to one other thing, I just want to address this in ending. You asked me in a certain way, is there a future for communism, or what will communism look like in the 21st century, or what will communism look like when it is not a European movement, but a movement of what Du Bois called the darker races. See, I think we're talking about, and let me just begin with it. Communism as a movement emerges out of the European class struggle. What we might call scientific socialism, or the socialism of Marx and Engels and Lenin and so on and so forth, is a European movement. It is bounded by the assumptions of European civilization, and it was a great movement, great rupture. But now we're in a period of what I like to call communism plus. That communism cannot go forward solely on the foundations of European philosophical, ideological, and civilizational assumptions. It now, in order to go forward, will go forward on the foundations of the civilizations and struggles of the non-white world. And I therefore call that communism plus the great ancient civilizations and their continuing struggles against the West. So therefore, from the age of Europe to the age of humanity, we might say from the age of imperialism to the age of communism is what we're looking at. And in that, back to Bernie, whom I am not, I don't have any personal issues with. My issues with him are mainly political. I didn't like him referring to the great Hugo Chavez as a dead communist dictator. Who is he to say such a thing about a leader of a country, of a people? But it said more about Bernie than about Hugo Chavez. But so in the larger picture, Bernie is a fading footnote in a great march forward. And so people like ourselves, you and myself, and what will be the left of the future, it is a left that seeks to unite the American working class and the American people with the darker races of humanity. It is a left that understands the great spiritual and artistic, cultural, intellectual, and political contribution of an oppressed group in our own country, the African-American people. A unique, unusual, and a small people who have made a contribution the likes of which few nations have made in the modern world. A nation, the U.S. nation, who will see, like Baldwin was arguing for, that once you understand the message that black people bring, then it will not only free black people, but it will free white people from whiteness. And in freeing white people from whiteness, we will free the nation from imperialism and war and open the door to America becoming a part of humanity.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.